I think part of what we're seeing is a a shift where now that Am Yisrael have sovereignty in the land of Israel, we may be entering an era where, at least with respect to Israel, because obviously it looks different from the perspective of Jews who are still living in Galut outside of Israel, but at least from the perspective of Israel, we need to stop saying, "Oh, these people are killing us just because we're Jews," or in like that the war they're waging us is somehow fundamentally racist or fundamentally bigoted or fundamentally hateful, and that's what makes it wrong. It doesn't matter whether it's any of those things. If it's a war against us, we have to fight it, we have to win it, and we don't need permission from the rest of the world to do that, and we shouldn't seek it because that will just paralyze us in how we prosecute that fight. And I think the last thing to say along these lines is that what is true is I think sometimes when people talk about the topic of anti-Semitism, there's a little bit of this tendency to speak almost fatalistically about this idea that it's this inexplicable magical property of Jews that we just can't help being hated even as the virus evolves, so to speak. And so it was first because of the teachings of the Catholic Church or what have you, and then it was for a race, and then it was for being communists, and then it was for being capitalists, and then it was for having a nation state. Talking about it as though it always just keeps on going, and it's just this fact of human history that can never change. In one sense, that's true. But what's true is that we should not be surprised that there always are people who have a problem with Hashem, the people of Hashem, because there always are people who have a problem with Hashem. And this is, best summarized, as I think we've mentioned before, by this midrash about Haman wearing an idol around his neck. And that when Mordechai refused to bow to Haman, he was really refusing to bow to the idol around Haman's neck. And that is what incensed Haman and made him want to destroy the Jews. So there is something about being this idol smashing people where if the whole rest of the world is in the throes of one form of idolatry or another, you're always going to be able to engender some hatred of Hashem because the idols engender hatred of Hashem. And that's the universal mechanism that is, in a sense, always the explanation for what we call like anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews or whatever you want to call it, as it rears its head in all of its many incarnations. But does that mean that it just goes on like that forever and you can't change it? And there's some kind of weird magical property that Jews have where we would like to just blend in and stop being hated more than other nations, but we can't because there's something in the code, the way that it's written, that just won't allow that to happen. I don't think that's the case, but I think when we pose the question that way, it's because we're missing the point a little bit. Actually, all this complaining about, why does everyone hate us and, why the double standards? It doesn't even make sense to ask the question when you look at how Yahadut and Torah are constructed. According to the Torah, we are regarded as being different than other nations, right? Like the idea that it should be possible to fade into the background and become just like other nations, given the definition of our nation, according to Torah, is preposterous because the whole point is that we're supposed to be an Am Segula, like a sort of a people that has a special definition and relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Mamlechet Kohanim, a Goy Kadosh, right? A nation of priests and a separate and special and different nation. And to the degree that that's the case, that means that we shouldn't expect that the world reacts to us in the way that it reacts to all the other different kinds of, Ruthenians and Maori and whatever other kinds of nations you could find all around the world. However, that doesn't mean it always has to be negative. And that, I think, is the thing where we can really take home hope from our sources, right? The ultimate vision that we see from our Nevi'im, from our prophets, is Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah u'devar Adonai Yerushalayim, right? That from Zion Torah will go out and the word of Hashem from Yerushalayim. That ultimately we see ourselves as having this priestly role where we can be teachers. We can teach the world about HaKadosh Baruch Hu and about his Torah. And if we embrace that role, then we start down possibly the long and bumpy and difficult path, but we start down the path of turning the uniqueness and specialness of Am Yisrael into something that could eventually engender exceptionally positive relationships with the rest of humanity, right? But if we're not seeking that role, and instead we're in this kind of awkward, contorted posture of trying to retain our identity as Am Yisrael, and at the same time also see if maybe we could be regarded as just like any other nation, then that isn't going to work. That won't take. Like that will always only work halfway, and the partial success of it is what produces this kind of immune reaction where, then we become this lightning rod and we can't help being always the ones that people have an especially big problem with for some reason. And that was true individually for Jews who tried to assimilate into other countries, as they did in the 18th and 19th century in Europe. And it's also true at an international level, or at the level of international relations.